This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thank you. The title, I'm afraid I don't have slides, so I'll read you the title. It's "People of our condition have not any right to expect stability or certainty of subsistence. Middle-class men's experience of receiving charity in mid-19th century England." A letter published by the Manchester Examiner and Times newspaper on the 3rd of March 1860 closed a correspondence between Samuel Bamford and his erstwhile friend Rupertino. The latter, having found Bamford struggling with the utmost poverty, had endeavoured to obtain a civil list pension for him on the grounds of either his political history or his local literary standing or his manly English character. Bamford replied, "We have never been ashamed of honest poverty, and hope we never shall be, but we have always maintained the self-respect which has exacted the respect of others. Whatever may have been our exigencies and our difficulties, we have never made talk of them. We have kept them to ourselves, scarcely to a friend so much as distantly alluding to them. In the humblest condition of honest life, there is such a thing as becoming pride, and that pride we have constantly endeavoured to be worthy of and to maintain." Bamford's response to what was intended as a benevolent gesture reveals his delicately balanced feelings and attitudes to offers of support and financial assistance. This paper explores the emotional landscape of male middle-class recipients of charity and patronage to establish whether, to use Barbara Rosenwein's terminology, they formed emotional communities, evidenced by systems of feeling using articulated or implied norms. The sources examined are Samuel Bamford's diary and letters sent to the Clothing Society for the benefit of poor pious clergymen of the established church and their families. This paper also considers whether, in the sphere of philanthropy, emotions are gendered. The cumbersome nature of the written word presents a challenge to the historian who wishes to pin down the butterfly evanescence of feelings. All we can do is pay close attention to the feelings expressed by individual historical actors. As Rosenwein says, even an apparently intimate diary can only provide an approximation of the emotional life of its subject. We cannot know for sure if the feelings expressed are purely conventional, idealised, manipulative, or deeply felt. Nevertheless, how the writers chose to represent themselves in these sources is, in itself, significant, as self-presentation was an important aspect of successful applications for charity and patronage. The diaries of Samuel Bamford were written between February 1858 and December 1861. Bamford made no applications to charitable institutions, but the people who gave him donations of material items were from inside and outside his network of immediate friends. So Prochaska's broad definition of philanthropy as kindness, which includes informal expressions in a domestic setting, is applicable here. The subjective experience of those who participated in philanthropic giving is largely hidden, and this holds true for the experience of individuals who were the recipients of charity. The poor have left few records, and this extends even to the middle classes. Evidence of how they felt about applying for and receiving charity is scarce, which may be indicative of an uneasiness regarding the process and what it represented. Patronage operated in a less structured way than charity, but it is considered here as charity's close adjunct, with similar systems of convention for the recipient to negotiate. Patronage was fundamental to the middle classes in their pursuit of security, as their social sensitivities and hopes were frequently in conflict with the economic reality of their lives. Bamford's diaries and letters offer an exceptional insight into the emotional world of a lower middle-class man living in poverty and reliant on the beneficence of others. Bamford's entry in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography is headed "Radical," which gives little sense of the variousness of his career. At different times, he was a handloom weaver, warehouseman, farm worker, boatman, soldier, newspaper journalist, civil servant, and writer. Historians have largely focused on his early life, which included his experience of the Peterloo massacre, and he is usually described as a working-class radical. However, recently, Margot Finn has highlighted his liminal status, describing him as having risen from the ranks of labour to the penumbra of the lower middle class. His father had been a weaver, but while Bamford was still a child, he became the master of Salford Workhouse. Bamford himself, although he urged pity for the poor, was an apologist for the workhouse practice of separating married couples. Thus, his familial background and his attitude to the poor law system reveal a man who was never a solid member of the working class. In his writing, Bamford refers to himself as a working man, but he admitted that when he ceased to be a weaver, the working weavers never heartily forgave him. He was not longer one of them, and being so alienated, the bonds of friendship gradually became relaxed until, on their part, coldness supervened. By the time Bamford was having his exchange with Rupertino, he was aged 72 and was trying to make a living by giving public readings of his works, having moved back to his home county of Lancashire with his wife Mima in 1858. Income from this source was precarious from the start. One night in December 1858, he was haunted by terrible apprehension of exigency, want and destitution, and 2 days later recorded that they were nearly out of coal and absolute want and starvation will soon be in the house. By mid-April 1859, the couple had only 19 shillings and sixpence in the world and had already pawned their silver teaspoons and Mima's dress. At the end of July, he wondered whether to stay at home and pay the rent or use the rent money to travel to Colne to see if he could make more there. By May 1861, he was inquiring about possible purchasers for his books and superfluous household furniture because I would not run into debt if I could avoid it. As will be seen, Bamford's ability to make pragmatic decisions about his finances was often overtaken by his desire to maintain appearances. Bamford's attitude to his poverty was both defiant and resigned, teetering on the edge of humiliation despite the proud stance of his riposte to Rupertino. He wrote to a friend, "All would be well enough were it not for the state of exigency in which we feel ourselves, and to which I am beginning to be almost reconciled. Indeed, I am nearly persuaded people of our condition have not any right to expect stability or certainty of subsistence. At any rate, whatever comes of it, I shall never stoop to any discreditable humiliation." In a letter to the Chadderton and Tongue Mutual Improvement Society, he exhorted, "Integrity and strict honesty would mark all our dealings with our fellow men, not that honesty that which consists in paying money debts alone, but that which discharges or endeavours to discharge all due obligations to others." Nevertheless, in private, he was less sanguine, revealing the inner conflict that the struggle simply to buy food wrought in him. In July 1859, having obtained a shoulder of lamb on credit, he recorded, "This is much against my ideas of rectitude. It seems shabby, shifty, and I feel humiliated." In spite of these feelings, by this point Bamford had been borrowing money from friends for some time, although his unease at this is evidenced by the speed with which he took offence when he believed that one of these friends had failed to send him a copy of the local newspaper because he owed him a sovereign. In April 1859, a friend suggested that a subscription could be raised to purchase an annuity for Bamford and Mima. Bamford had had previous experience of being the recipient of a subscription, as one had been raised for him in 1846. To the displeasure of some of the subscribers, he insisted on taking the money as a lump sum, which he used to publish his autobiography of his youth. 4 years later, he was in financial difficulties again, and a position was found for him under the patronage of the chairman of the board of the Inland Revenue at Somerset House. It has been suggested that Bamford was happy to accept donations from patrons to supplement his income from writing. In fact, Bamford was only comfortable with receiving patronage if he felt that he was in control of how the process was managed and presented. In April 1859, he agreed that a subscription might be done, but it was a thing I could not start myself. A letter in the Oldham Advertiser supporting the purchase of an annuity praised his career as a reformer, describing him as having a monotonous existence within the humble walls of a cottage at Harperley, unthought of and uncared for. Bamford was delighted with the proposal. In contrast with Rupertino's public plea on his behalf 10 months later, the correspondence had not made the mistake of revealing Bamford's level of poverty. By referring to Bamford's service to his country, he offered Bamford a platform on which he could list his sufferings. Crosses, losses, privations, exigency, contumely, outrage, unjust condemnation, chains, imprisonments have each and all been endured by me. And it allowed him to state his right to compensation for the past, which he could, with self-respectful gratitude, accept and becomingly assume. Several of the men who campaigned on his behalf for a subscription or a civil list pension appear to have been only acquaintances, although Bamford took to calling them friends in his diary. This shows that he was not only a member of the middle class, but that he knew how the conventions of patronage worked. The word friend could be used in a way recognisable in the 21st century, but it also referred to people who could be turned to for guidance, assistance, and the prospect of preferment. A claim of friendship was a persuasive influence on a patron in their distribution of patronage. Bamford had many such friends, although he complained often about their neglect, and his relationship with his patron, Sir James K. Shuttleworth, shows this in action. At the beginning of their correspondence, Bamford signed himself, "Your obliged servant." As the connection developed, Bamford provided K. Shuttleworth with information about education and working men in return for a retainer. After 2 months, K. Shuttleworth wrote to him, "You are not to regard yourself in any other light than as my personal friend who has done me some service, and who allows me the privilege of contributing slightly to the comfort of one whose genius I have long admired, and whose services to public freedom have been ill requited." It is difficult to imagine a letter more calculated to flatter and soothe Bamford, its references to his independence, his genius, and his public service according so closely with his own view of himself. Nevertheless, Bamford replied as an obliged, humble servant, as one of K. Shuttleworth's humble friends, who he hoped would never be unworthy of his good opinion. Bamford signed off his next letter, "Your obliged, humble servant and friend." In his correspondence with K. Shuttleworth, Bamford never stopped referring to himself as some version of an obliged, obedient and humble servant. He called K. Shuttleworth his friend, but was always alive to where the power lay in their relationship. The diary trails off 12 months later in a way that expresses so much of Bamford's ambivalence and bitterness about patronage. K. Shuttleworth had sent £5, and Bamford commented, "I thought Sir James had forgotten me, as many of my friends have done, but I am... Because of their economic inequality, Bamford was unable to reconcile the roles of friend and client. Presentation, both material and intangible, was important to Bamford. In a draft letter to a newspaper putting his case for financial support from the government, he characterised himself as a poor handloom weaver, waiting for what was owed him by a great, rich and powerful nation for the sufferings he had endured during his politically active years. This was disingenuous, as he had stopped being a weaver well over 30 years earlier. By drawing attention to this part of his past, he was almost certainly trying to elicit sympathy from a public which would have been well aware of the devastating and ongoing decline in the handloom weaving industries. He was also tapping into the growing myth of the self-sufficiency and freedom of traditional handloom weavers. Thus, his blatant portrayal of himself as powerless was balanced with the subtext of previous independence. Bamford was also very concerned about his physical appearance. As Vivian Richmond points out, the absence of an acceptable appearance could generate immense shame and was a cause of self-inflicted as well as externally produced social exclusion. Thus, when K. Shuttleworth first asked him to visit, Bamford initially considered declining the invitation because "the only coat I have which is fit for a Sunday had just been pawned." The resourceful mimer produced a dress which she had been holding back for emergencies and swapped it for her husband's coat at the pawn shop. Bamford agreed to the visit, but was still worried. "My hat certainly is a little crushed on one side, and my trousers rather worn at bottom. My coat is good, my waistcoat barely decent, but Sir James has had poor Lancashire men as his guest before now, and he will, I trust, excuse my barely passable appearance. Mimer will sponge and trim up as well as can." Clothing did not have to be new, but for the wearer to be respectable, it had to be clean, in good repair, and appropriate for the occasion. Bamford seems to have been unable to convince himself that his appearance was acceptable, because in the 4 weeks following his visit to Kay Shuttleworth, he bought himself a hat, trousers and waistcoat, costing a total of £2 and 6 shillings. Bamford may have fretted about obtaining a shoulder of lamb on credit, but it was an extravagant purchase for someone who had no reserves or steady income. Only 2 years later, Isabella Beeton noted that a shoulder of lamb was one of the most expensive cuts of meat available. What Mima thought of this is, of course, unrecorded, but we do know that she was a practitioner of old-fashioned self-sufficiency because she did her own brewing and baking. Bamford sets out a range of gifts received of seasonal foods, including apples, peas, gooseberries and cauliflowers, and festive foods, including mince pies and simnel cakes, all of which he was happy to accept. This is in contrast to gifts of coal, which he describes refusing or being reluctant to accept. This difference in attitude was likely to have been due to an understanding that food gifts were an important part of social intercourse. Bamford was altogether less comfortable accepting gifts of money. At the beginning of September 1859, he received 2 shillings from an anonymous lady as what he described as charitable contributions. This made him uneasy. "I cannot accept money in this way except as payment for books." However, he understood in this instance that the gesture was well meant and concluded that he must put up with such actions for the sake of the kind motives which prompt them. It may not be a coincidence that 2 days later he wrote a strong defence of his decision to pursue compensation from the government, which reveals bitterness at his friends' and patrons' inertia, mixed with a fierce pride in his manly independence. He described himself as a poor man, but a very proud man, honestly, manfully proud, I trusted, and I would see the best of them in the furthest nook of hell sooner than go begging them to do it for me. 6 months later, it was this pride in his independence which meant that he could not countenance the public offer of assistance from Rupertino. In the immediate aftermath of the Rupertino affair, Bamford accepted without comment 5 shillings from a lawyer who was previously unknown to him. He may have felt able to ignore this incident, as on the same day he received notice that he had unexpectedly been awarded £50 from the Royal Bounty Fund. The news caused a state of feeling which I may describe as one of pleasing pain, he said. Despite this complex and ambivalent reaction, the thanks which he offered to his supporters were fulsome and florid, again showing his understanding of the patronage relationship. He wrote to Thomas Basley MP expressing to him all the grateful sentiments which kindness such as yours ought to inspire. Those sentiments I beg to assure you I experienced in a degree to which any expression which I have at command is inadequate. Nevertheless, Bamford was fussy about the way in which a regular income should be procured for him and the format it should take. He did not want a civil list pension because I had not any wish to see my name on the list which read like a beggarly roll of paupers receiving their pay. Civil list pensions were granted ostensibly by the sovereign in accordance with principles agreed by the House of Commons. They could be awarded in recognition of personal services to the Crown, by the performance of duties to the public, or by useful discoveries in science and attainment in literature and the arts. What Bamford wanted was just compensation, and he would not accept a pension from the government or any other gift, dole or gratuity which they could bestow. After an income had been secured for Bamford by other means, he concluded that he would rather not have a government pension, as, after living free all my days, I don't like the idea of dying with a government collar round my neck. It would not be the sort of death which an old patriot ought to submit to. It is possible that Bamford feared that ultimately he would be rejected for a pension, as there is evidence that those from upper middle class backgrounds received pensions more quickly and at a higher rate than those from a lower middle class background, and Bamford's conviction after Peterloo for inciting a riot cannot have been without difficulty for those considering his case. In May 1861, Bamford learned that a private subscription was being organised to assist him. He expressed himself resignedly. Though I would certainly drag on without such help if I could, my position, sorry as I am to say it, leaves me without alternative. I am entirely in the hands of those who have the means and the will to render aid. On 21st July 1861, Bamford finally heard that the subscription had been a success and that he was to receive £1 every month. Bamford's response was typically mixed: satisfied, ungracious and rueful. He declared that this is doing business as it should be done, and that it was especially right that the people of Lancashire should give him compensation because they are the parties who have benefited by my exertions and sufferings. So, Samuel Bamford's writings offer a portrait of a complex, independent and proud man living in poverty on the fringes of the middle class. Bamford's finely tuned appreciation of his position resulted in him feeling uncomfortable about accepting charity from strangers, loans from friends and credit from tradespeople. It also made him acutely conscious of his appearance, which could result in him spending recklessly. His belief in the rightness of his claim for compensation from the state enabled him to accept campaigns on his behalf from acquaintances, but he rudely rebuffed the offer of assistance from Rupertino because his poverty was revealed to the public gaze and, one senses, not enough was made of his political career. He could express gratitude and humility when social convention required, but his private feeling was of pleasing pain rather than thankfulness. For all his self-respect and self-reliance, Bamford, because of his very real hardship, was forced reluctantly to accept the financial support which others arranged for him. Bamford's diaries have a rather different tone from the letters of the clergymen who wrote to the Clothing Society for the benefit of poor pious clergymen of the established church and their families. One wrote, for example, "When we are sitting round our hearth, we talk over our dress, and one points to one thing and another to another, all and each supplied by your parcel, and then thankfulness to God fills our hearts. May He who is able make grace abound unto you." The letters were sent to the administrator of the society during 1852. Following the society's usual precedent, 27 anonymous letters were published in its annual report for that year. Together they provide evidence of a small emotional community where the constituents were unlikely to have met but expressed similar feelings to those conveyed in the above extract: gratitude and Christian fellowship consistent with an understanding of how the community worked. The society had been founded by Phyllis Peyton and Mary Lamb in 1820 in response to the poverty they had encountered amongst some clergy. Analysis of the level of poverty experienced by clergy who did not have an independent income falls outside the scope of this paper. Suffice to say that in 1835, over 4,800 benefices paid less than £200 a year, at a time when it was reckoned that £300 was the minimum required to attain middle-class dignity. A letter from an earlier report highlights the particular difficulties clergy faced with their professional garb. Custom compels us to dress in what is literally the most expensive wear of all that is worn by gentlemen, I mean black cloth. As we have seen, not having the correct clothing in any given situation could induce shame and social marginalisation. By 1852, Miss Lamb appears to have been operating alone, not only dispensing not altogether new clothing and cloth for making clothes and household linen, but also handing out books and tracts for individual use or for parochial distribution. Prochaska lists the society as one of only 13 societies which were managed by women, and it is the only society which does not refer to ladies, females or sisters in its title. Thus it occupied an unusual position in the Victorian philanthropic world because of its female founder and management, but also because of Miss Lamb's connection with the men she sought to help. One model of the relationship between donors and beneficiaries identifies strategies used by donors in their communication with beneficiaries, which form the context within which beneficiaries are expected to operate. For example, donors can seek to know and be known by the beneficiaries, and sometimes allow beneficiaries to compel attention to their needs. The letters suggest that the beneficiaries' relationship with the society fitted this strategy. It is clear that beneficiaries were allowed to write with a list of their requirements, but that they might receive additional items which the society thought might be useful. Furthermore, it is obvious that beneficiaries were asked to provide news of their work and that inquiries were made as to beneficiaries' families' health. Despite the inequality between donors and beneficiaries, the latter can offer moral currency to the former. Beneficiaries may obtain a favourable outcome from donors by persuading them of the value of the opportunity to donate. The beneficiary needs to offer some kind of reward, and there is a need for potential beneficiaries to understand what the donor might want. In the letters, the beneficiaries reward Miss Lamb in a number of ways. Unsurprisingly, all of them express gratitude, but 15 of them also comment on her and her associates' kindness. Indeed, one of the correspondents confirms that this is the only reward that he can provide. For your continued kindness, we cannot make any return than these feeble thanks, or we would gladly do it. Nearly half of the valedictions contain the words grateful, gratefully, or gratitude. In addition to thanks, 17 of the beneficiaries offer a prayer, usually to Miss Lamb personally. Nearly all of the correspondence refer to God, which, whilst not unexpected, evokes the Anglican Christian fellowship common to themselves and Miss Lamb. Some rewards are by way of the requested news. 15 of the beneficiaries mention or give details of their children or families. For example, my wife and daughters could not make the respectable appearance they do but for the contents of your parcels. News of their schools and teaching is given by 5 of the writers, and of church matters by 7. Thus, the writers in this emotional community show that they recognised a model of gratitude which was likely to please their benefactor. The fact that these letters were chosen for publication suggests that they were correct. Out of the 27 letters, 20 were written by the clergyman and only 3 by their wives. In one case, the husband and wife wrote separate letters. It is possible that, as a spinster, Miss Lamb found that corresponding with respected professional men who expressed a debt of gratitude to her elevated her own sense of status and was a reward in itself. Prochaska points to a strong sense of Christian benevolence as a motivating factor for women philanthropists, and it would be surprising if that were not present here. However, he also detects that the women, especially those without families, experienced great pleasure in their work with the poor and were gratified when they were called dear or friend, and it was made clear to them that they were needed. A large proportion of the correspondence refer to Miss Lamb as a friend. It is difficult to say whether this is a reward because it was something that she particularly sought, or a mechanism that beneficiaries deployed to make their need of charitable help more acceptable. Both of these, probably unconscious motivations, may have been present. With more conscious intent, the use of friend might have been acknowledgement of the secular patronage relationship or a claim to Christian fellowship. All participants in the correspondence would have been aware of Jesus' instruction to his disciples, "Ye are my friends, if you do whatsoever I command you. Henceforth I call you not servants, for the servant knoweth not what his Lord doeth, but I have called you friends." As a further example of the reward strategy, it has been suggested that the reciprocity intrinsic to a gift relationship was met in 18th and 19th century charities by beneficiaries being deserving rather than merely in need. Thus, giving was made dependent upon the return gift expected from the beneficiary, i.e. the status of being deserving. 12 of the 27 beneficiaries appear to have offered this type of return gift, either by referencing their past or current financial hardship and/or their relief at receiving the parcel of goods. One correspondent, for example, said, "The box contained many things of which we stood in much need, which the narrowness of our income with the peculiar calls upon me just now put it entirely out of my power to procure." The sense of relief was either communicated quite directly: "Our warmest gratitude is due to you for relieving us from anxiety in the matter of how shall we be clothed," or was apparent in the correspondence references to a feeling of solace. "Many hearts have been comforted and still continue to be comforted by the society which you manage. As regards ourselves, I know not what we could have done many years past without your aid." Although this is not stated explicitly, the donations from the society clearly enabled some of the clergy to maintain social status in ways unconnected with the need for appropriate dress. One of the clergy wives refers to making clothes for herself and her children and, when they become shabby, passing them to poor parishioners, adding, "I was much pleased to see the flannel shirts, for they are in constant demand among our old and infirm poor people." This would have enabled her husband to meet the expectation that he would dispense charity to his flock, which poor clergy found so difficult to achieve. Clergy were able to participate in the intellectual life often denied them by passing the books on to a local magistrate or circulating the tracts. Given the similar format of previous annual reports, it is likely that at least some of the letter writers knew that their words would be printed, although they would remain unnamed. The Society was at pains to protect the identity of its beneficiaries, thus granting them not only material goods, but anonymity at a time when this was not guaranteed to recipients of charity. Responding to a request for more details of cases to be published in order to command greater sympathy and interest, the Society replied, "We consider that to give publicity to peculiar features of a case is to betray the trust which is reposed in us, and would infringe the delicacy and secrecy which, at the very outset of our work, we imposed upon ourselves." It is impossible to say to what extent the reassurance afforded by strictly maintained confidentiality liberated the correspondents to express their feelings, but a few of them did use Miss Lamb as confidants to whom they revealed their emotional reactions to physical and spiritual problems in a way that exceeds the fulfilment of their obligations as recipients. The writer of letter E was worried about the status of their relationship. "I had missed your letters, but I was afraid to write, lest you should suppose that I did so from interested motives. But this, I can assure you, would not have been the case." He went on to outline the effect of a most distressing ailment with which he was afflicted, and the spiritual difficulties that this had caused him. "I am, however, humbled to think how little I have realised the true spirit of Christ's gospel in my affliction, how much there has been of impatience, and how little of that calm submission to my Father's will." The writer of letter W, who had a wife and 9 children, explained that they kept from temporal distress by self-denial, which he believed was a part of Christian duty. "Nevertheless," he said, "it is not always easy to trust in God in a dark and gloomy hour, but perhaps this very feeling of difficulty is only a part of God's way to fit us for a future state." He signed himself, "Your unworthy servant," thus placing himself firmly in a subordinate position to Miss Lamb. The models of donor-beneficiary relationships offer a way of understanding why professional Victorian men would allow themselves to be drawn into such a warm correspondence with a woman in relation to whom in this situation they were subordinate. And our understanding of 19th century patronage and Christian fellowship contextualises those relationships. That the writers understood their dependent position is well illustrated by the writer's expressions of fears of not receiving further parcels. "I have been daily expecting to hear from you, but in this I have hitherto been disappointed, and I hope you will excuse me for writing to ask whether I may anticipate another parcel from you this year. We are indeed much in want of help in the way of clothing." Feelings of gratitude are here accompanied by anxiety, hope, trust, and relief. Pride, so prominent in Samuel Bamford's writings, is notably absent, but one correspondent, before offering his thanks, commented that it was humiliating to the natural feelings to be the object of such bounty. 3 letters from clergy wives is a very small sample from what is already a limited range of correspondence. Nevertheless, it is interesting to note that the women exhibit the same understanding of the need to express gratitude, Christian fellowship, and relief from anxiety as their husbands. We will never know if that was why their letters were chosen for publication, but on the basis of the evidence available, there is no gender split within this emotional community. The diaries of Samuel Bamford and the letters to the Clothing Society describe a wide range of emotions. They represent the genuinely felt experience of the writers and/or their ability to accord with conventions required by relationships with friends, patrons, and fellow Christians. Most obviously, both Bamford and the clergy were directly fulsome in their gratitude to their patrons and donors, as was required by the precepts and strategies under which they were operating. But Bamford sought to counterbalance his expressions of humility and thanks by other public utterances in which he declared his independence, of which he was abstractly very proud, even if it had little basis in reality. In private, his bitterness and shame were given full rein. Only one of the clergy mentioned experiencing humiliation, but his expression of this is telling. By saying that receiving charity was humiliating to the natural feelings, he made the emotion essentialist. One wonders if this experience was so common to the emotional community of charity recipients as to be usually not worth commenting on. Bamford and the clergy do not represent a coherent emotional community, the former expressing greater ambivalence about his position as a beneficiary than the clergy. However, it is evidence that both attached huge importance to appropriate self-presentation. The need for correct, respectable clothing is made very clear. Bamford's feelings on being given financial donations were always a mixture of pragmatism and discomfort. He was more at ease receiving physical gifts, and the clergy and their wives' foremost responses to accepting their parcels were gratitude and relief from anxiety, which suggests that receiving material goods was easier for the middle classes to manage emotionally than money. It would be interesting to know if any of the men felt guilty about the impoverishment in which they had placed their families, and it is hoped that further research into the experience of bankruptcy will illuminate this area. Only Bamford specifically mentioned his manliness, which he connected to his sense of independence. There was little difference between the representations made to Miss Lamb by the clergy wives and their husbands, suggesting that both genders had a good understanding of the requirements of the donor-beneficiary relationship. Their relationship with the resourceful spinster is intriguing and hints that accepted gender roles were not inflexible when actions were carried out in the name of Christian fellowship. It is only a shame for us that Miss Lamb is as silent in the archives as the equally capable Mima. Thank you.